When I was 18 years old, on my 18th birthday, me and a couple of my friends decided to go out and buy some cigarettes and some cigars to celebrate the ability to purchase cigarettes and cigars. As we're leaving the shop, we were stopped and frisked by local police. They looked at me. I actually did not get patted down. I was the only one out of the group that they seemed to not really care about. I don't know why. But they looked at and patted down some of my friends. And for one of my friends, Cameron, they had him spread out on the ground, fingers spread, toes spread, and they thoroughly searched him. Now, Cameron is one of the best guys that I've ever known. He's one of my best friends, and I've been friends with him since I was 4 years old. And the best thing that I think that I understand about Cameron is that his dad was a freaking genius. Cameron's dad taught him that there were two different worlds. The world that I live in and come from, and the world that he lived in and comes from. And it's in that Cameron did not ever really engage with some of the stupid stuff that we would do, because the world would have a completely different outlook and outcome for his actions versus some white kid from the suburbs actions. Today we're going to have a difficult conversation. I think a necessary conversation, but I love that anything that I say is to encourage empathy for each other. I'm going to state something that I believe very deeply right here at the start of it, but at the core of this video, I don't want it to be all about me. I'd like to highlight the voices of others, and I'm going to show some DMs and some different Twitter threads that I think bring in a different kind of voice, one that I cannot bring in. But still, I want to start with this so you understand the context of how I think and how I perceive, both as a content creator, as a father, and as a human being who just wants to encourage and always try to be better. I will never understand the world that Cameron comes from. I don't want to presume or try to imply that I get it, because I won't. That's just not who I am, and it's not the experience I've had. I have been a minority in a specific area and victim of racism directly, but this story isn't about me, and maybe we'll save that story for another day. But that being said, I truly believe in our modern day, in society right now, in social media, that we are being weaponized and manipulated by the powers that be. Those, we could say billionaires and trillionaires, and those actually in power to keep us, the people, fighting one another, and rather than uniting and telling the powers that be that the real power is with us. Now, I don't know if you agree with that or not. You probably might have different experiences, but I feel a lot of this stuff is manufactured in order for engagement, for clicks, but it's manufactured on top of a reality that we have to be willing to accept, and we have to be willing to try and at least understand, so that we can hopefully start to heal these great sins that have happened in our country, these great sins that have happened over generations. And that's not going to happen with obviously the dialect and that happens online. I think this question specifically from IGN is manufactured to drive interest in the article and frustration and references and discussion. And that's why it is put there. I have seen this happen, especially with IGN over, it feels like the last decade, but more and more, all of this leads to frustration on all sides, and no one really is talking. It all just ends up becoming people are kind of trying to yell at each other and try to change each other's minds, which, as I've told close and personal friends, like, when was the last time a tweet had somebody go, "Oh, I never thought of it that way"? Anyway, I just want to encourage us to all look at it from an opportunity to practice empathy, an opportunity to become better human beings, to listen and to not worry about virtue signaling and some of the awful things that have developed through social media. So with that all being said, I want to also fully quote Yoshi-P in what is driving a lot of the dialect, but I think I'm going to start with the message that kind of really kicked off the reason why this video is existing. And I've been asked not to show their name, and with respect to that, absolutely. I did get permission to show the context of their message specifically, and they also provided a few other highlights of people on Twitter that I'll also reference, because those messages are in fact public. We'll read those as well, and ideally this will be a difficult conversation, but a good one and a necessary one, and one that we can look back at in a good way, in a positive way. But we'll see. It is the internet after all. So first and foremost, let's dive in. Hello, Brian. I hope you're doing well, and I doubt you see this message, but I figured at least I'd send this in the hopes that if you see this, that it is my concern over recent interviews with Yoshi-P about Final Fantasy XVI. I need to stress that no one is calling Yoshi-P a racist after he answered about having a more diverse cast in a game. This sort of thing is literally a common occurrence whenever someone of color questions why there isn't any diversity in this sort of media. It gets blown out of proportion and ultimately makes people who have genuine concern be called snowflakes or being offended. This topic of having black and brown characters in a Final Fantasy setting, having been around before video games were a thing. It is a very sensitive topic, and you should have extreme care and tact when discussing it on social media. Again, I'm stressing this to you as a black person that no one is calling Yoshi-P racist, but we are disappointed in his answer. In a fantasy setting, there shouldn't be any reasons to just not have POCs or people of color, whether it be a main protagonist or just a background filler character. I will still get the game because I know I like Final Fantasy games and their stories. I just wish people could have these discussions without trying to drown out people of color's concerns when it pertains to fictional stories. This is such a great message, and my, again, thoughts and responses here are my own. I'm not trying to speak for any group or viewpoint out there, but this is just the point of view of Brian, is that I actually believe that representation is important in games and in media, and especially in a fantasy setting. However, there is obviously various different lines, right? Because I think this is a kind of a case of damned if you do, damned if you don't in today's current climate, because inserting something like that could have the opposite, like the same effect, opposite position of they're just doing it because of this. They're forcing something that doesn't naturally fit. I see this happening on Time Online, and my personal viewpoint of it is I don't care. Like, if it's a fantasy world, we should be able to do what we want with that fantasy world. And that's it, because you're just sitting down and writing it. I understand, and we're going to jump into Yoshi-P's full response here, because I think it's important to make sure we highlight exactly what he said. But at its core, okay, like, there's a part of what Yoshi-P says that I'm like, it just seems like whether it was intentional or not. And I think maybe that's kind of the thing that I would kind of focus in on from my perspective, is that, like, is it intentional? Like, oh no, we actually need to kind of push this to the side, or is it essentially just because, like, I don't think in terms of like race specifically. I never really go like, oh, how is my actions, and like, oh, if I'm writing this story, I usually write and think from my own perspective. And it's interesting because, especially historically with Final Fantasy, and to this point, like, there's a historical context here that has been excluded within fantasy for very like wide range of reasons. I don't need to cover it all completely for you now, but when it comes down to it, is that, like, it's an interesting perspective, because, like, up until, like, I think Final Fantasy X, did we really start to see even more Japanese style and Asian style influences in Final Fantasy. It was in a way very westernized in a European setting. So I've seen some comments and some things talking about the historical context, that, like, in a time where you don't have like travel and you don't have this globalization, like, there were groups of people who all looked the same, in this regards, and them setting this in this context is like, I get it. And at the same time, like, but we're the ones pinning it, right? Like, we are literally sitting down to write this. We can create the world in any which way that we want, but they're going to make those decisions. I think they were going to be screwed either way, personally, like, especially when this comes up, because back to that thought that I have is, like, I feels a lot of this is engineered to get that going, because in a way, like, it's all good press. You might not feel like that, but it's, people are talking about it, and then they're curious about it, and they're going to write articles about it. I've seen comedians talk about this aspect of, like, writing an article with the goal of in inducing rage, because that's how you get paid nowadays. And that's something that even within the context of me making this video, that same accusation is going to be leveraged. But there's, like, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. I'd rather be a person who states his beliefs as clearly as I can, than sitting here and be like, but anyway, let's jump into what Yoshi-P had to say, and let's talk about that now. So the question is, in regards to diversity in the game, can we expect to see black characters in Final Fantasy XVI or people of color, non-white characters in general? To clarify a bit more, there's been discussion around the trailers to date featuring mostly white characters, and I wanted to get a clarity on whether we can expect the final game to be more diverse. Yoshi-P says, "This is a difficult question, but not one that was unexpected. Seeing as diversity in entertainment and media has become a much discussed topic of late, the answer I have, however, may end up being disappointing to some depending on their individual expectations." Now, our design concept from the earliest stages of development has always heavily featured medieval Europe, incorporating historical, cultural, political, and anthropological standards that were prevalent at the time. When deciding on a setting that was best suited for the story we wanted to tell, the story of a land beset by blight, we felt that rather than create something on a global scale, it was necessary to limit the scope of a single landmass, one geographically and culturally isolated from the rest of the world in an age without airplanes, televisions, and telephones. Due to the underlying graphical, geological, and geopolitical constraints of the setting, Valistia was never going to be realistically as diverse as, say, modern-day Earth, or even Final Fantasy XIV, that has an entire planet and moon worth of nations, races, cultures, and at its disposal. The isolation nature of this realm, however, does end up playing a large part of the story, and one of the reasons why Valistila's fate is tied to the rest of the world. Ultimately, we felt that incorporating ethnic diversity into Valistila was important, and over-incorporation into a single corner as much larger world could end up causing a violation of those narrative boundaries we originally set for ourselves. The story we were telling is fantasy, yes, but it is also rooted in reality. Conversely, the Final Fantasy series of games have always inherently dealt with a conflict and struggle, especially between the empowered and those used to exploit, and those privileged few and prominent who tend in human history. In a game that by design allows players to experience that conflict and struggle firsthand through a dynamic, realistic battles, it can be challenging to assign distinctive ethnicities to either antagonist or protagonist without triggering audience preconceptions, inviting unwanted speculation, and ultimately stoking the flames of controversy. This is the best part of pulling inspiration directly from history, however, is that it allows us to revisit and re-examine our own past while allowing us to create something new. In the end, we simply want to focus on be less of the outward appearance of our characters and more on who they are as people who are complex and diverse in their natures, backgrounds, beliefs, and personalities, and motivations, people whose stories we can resonate and there is a diversity in Valistila, diversity that, while not all encompassing, is very synergistic with the setting we've created, and it's true to the inspirations from which we are drawing. So there's a couple key points that, like, he kind of points out, and this kind of ties to maybe even the frustration I had with Final Fantasy 15. It's that it's a fantasy, but it's based off of reality, when at the end of the day, like, it's a game and it could be a lot of fun, and it could just be a fantasy game that's based off of fantasy, and we can write what rules that we want to write. I'm not going to personally ding him for this. It wasn't anything that's on my radar, but just again, because people asked, that's just kind of how I feel about it. Again, also, I feel like this question in and of itself is put in there designed to essentially cause that frustration. And I don't think it's coming from Square Enix, but I think it's essentially like a part of the game, right? The fact that Yoshi-P's kind of expected this question coming, maybe they gave it to him beforehand. I don't know, but it sucks because it's so because we're going to dive now into a couple people's, what they've shared publicly, and there's hurt there, and rightfully so, in that regards. And yeah, I think now let's go ahead and highlight a couple other voices. So Megan writes, "I am disappointed, but I'm also not surprised by Yoshi-P's response. It's pretty frustrating that so many Japanese developers are pointing POC characters in front and center. Capcom consulted with their black employees to help develop Kimberly for Street Fighter VI, for example. And then for some reason, Final Fantasy XVI lacks POC because it's based off of medieval Europe. And even though in Final Fantasy in the past, it has put POC characters in front and center, regardless of that setting, it's based on a bunch of BS. Yoshi was better off just ignoring the question." Noodle says, "What Yoshi-P said is definitely a mess, but it is a black woman who interacts with a lot of pop culture stuff. I guess I'm disappointed, but not surprised. These companies are not out there trying to create media that includes people that look like me, because that doesn't necessarily make them a lot of money. I know it sounds like I'm just rolling over, but I just don't have it in me to be shocked, appalled, outraged. If you feel that way, my heart goes out to you, but me personally, I can't be let down if you already didn't expect it. And then Aurora here writes, I don't know how many times I have to say this, but this isn't about one developer or one game or even one franchise, but an issue endemic of the genre. And after hearing this from everyone ever in your entire life, it will not stop hurting no matter how numb you are to it. This is absolutely not hyperbole either. The first time somebody tried to tell that elves can't be black, I was 5. That was in 1986. M.F. Reagan was president. Believe this old broad when I say that decades of this does a number on you, no matter how above it you all try to act, no matter how strong you may be, no matter how much your own food you make, you get tired. And I'm tired, y'all. I've literally been writing fantasy, creating my own and remixing existing ones longer than a lot of y'all been breathing. And MFers still coming at me sideways, still crying, why did I write their favorite character black? Still calling my black femmes sus because they too are loved and powerful. White male head writers of games saying my OC hurt them because I rightfully called out their stuff for misogyny and rejected and wrote my own stuff. If y'all only knew a tenth of the stuff that I have to deal with, my God. So, no, I don't expect any better. I never have. 4 decades of this country and a descendant of enslaved Africans has taught me that nobody is checking for us, even without anything important, much less weird nerd stuff. In fact, that is the hit of Telegraphed does not make it any lesser of a sting. It honestly really sucks to say it, because in a way I always kind of think in my mind, kind of follow the money, right? Like, to the points where, like with Aurora, going off and writing her own fantasy and doing what she wants, I applaud that. I think that's exactly what needs to happen. And from a financial perspective, boycotting it, like all of that, every time we see these kind of conversations and frustrations happen online, they only end up making more sales, right? As soon as this goes beyond, like games media or journalism, so to speak, as soon as that becomes a bigger topic, it only will end up driving in more and more sales. And so it kind of, I can understand the feeling of that frustration of like, we keep saying, but it only seems to either have the opposite effect, or it only seems to be weaponized, or it only seems to be all these different things. So I would encourage, I would really encourage, like, in a way, to kind of take it into your own hands, like Aurora, like write your own fantasies, work to develop your own games. And the thing is that, the worst thing you can be in this country is poor. Like, that in and of itself, it's like the idea that someone's going to come and help you, like somebody in a personal one-on-one level will, but as a global sense of it, it's like it's sooner forgotten. If you look at our prison systems, for example, like they're sooner forgotten about, and it takes an extra effort, an extra level for somebody to actually go that extra mile and do that, to help try to lift people out of poverty, to help try and do these things. Now, this opens up a whole wide range of discussion topics, a whole bag of chips, if you will. And that, I think, goes well beyond this, right? Because all of a sudden, one of the things that frustrates me about like internet culture in a way is that whenever like everybody's like talking about one thing, you'll always have somebody come in and say, well, what about this other thing, right? Like, the reality is that with momentum, I don't think they're going to be changing Final Fantasy 16. Just FYI. And if they do, I don't think they win in that situation either. I could be wrong, and maybe that's the right way about it, but just from my experience is that, then the story is like Square Enix caves to pressure from, like this group, etc. And then that is where then the conversation goes. And then people, more people are literally continuing to fight. And that's, again, why I argue that I think a lot of this ends up being manufactured so that the people are fighting each other and not literally looking at some of these systems that are empowered by us being distracted and raging, this war. But again, those are just my thoughts and perspectives. You guys can, do with it as you will. But anyway, I'll include a link to these tweets if you guys want to go hit the like button on them. A lot of them have been shut off to like comments and replies, rightfully so, because again, the internet's a difficult place to have these difficult conversations. And but I think it's important that we continue to push forward and have these difficult conversations so we can become ideally better people. But I'm gonna leave you with that for this video itself. I hope that you got something good out of it. And if you did, let me know. And if you didn't, you're gonna let me know. And I'm gonna just love you guys the best way I can and say I love you. Hopefully you have a great rest of your day. Hopefully you got something good from this, and hopefully I will see you in my next video. But until then, take care.